Hello, class. Scott again for the week 4 discussion post. Sorry I'm a little late. As you can see, I'm at Jenkins headquarters, my parents' house. As you can see from the background, a lot better decor than what you see usually going on. Given that, I'm going to try and keep this one short. I'm still trying to get that 15-minute mark. It's been pretty hard. So I'm going to dive straight into it and get to part 1 of this week's discussion. Mainly going into Douglas and Silko and the similarities when it comes to nonfiction for this very brutal topic. And I think the main similarity can be summed up to justice for all, but not really. And where they differ, in my opinion at least, is that Douglas is portraying something that is no longer culturally relevant, whereas Silko is explaining something that could be considered relevant in today's society. So first, looking at Douglas's speech, there's a lot of emotion in there and a lot of great one-liners to quote and to have in your back pocket for conversations. But the main point that I took after him explaining why the 4th of July celebration was good for white America, basically, he goes into for the slave or the previous slave, to him the celebration is pretty much a sham, which I had never really thought about. That the 4th of July was our nation's independence, but really Black independence didn't come until later. But why would I think of something like that when in my entire generation that's never been an issue? So that kind of falls along the lines of, taking me at 28 years old, I read that now. It's not really relevant. It's crucial information to have, and it's powerful emotionally. But really, we've passed that in a large way. 2 lines that I think are great to remember from his speech. Oppression makes a wise man mad, and with brave men, there's always a remedy for oppression. That's a powerful statement, and the point that he was making was valid during his speech. But looking at it now, historically, it makes sense, but currently, it doesn't carry any emotion for me. I understand that what was going on. It was a powerful piece, but as I said, it's a dead topic, in my opinion, especially since it's so geared towards slavery. Now when we celebrate 4th of July, we correlate it with military, with, freedom and everything else. Never once in my 28 years have I been celebrating 4th of July and had somebody be like, whoa, have you ever thought about how it's not Black people's 4th of July? And I'm like, oh, no, never thought of that. However, shifting gears into Silko and basically talking about the border patrol on the southern side between the U.S. and Mexico, there was some relevance there. I'm not going to read all of it because I'm trying to stay under 15 minutes, but if you go to paragraph 9, there is a description in there that I felt was counterproductive, where she's talking about how she was detained one time, and she's describing the other people that were detained and describing the white Americans that would be detained, and how if they had long hair, they'd be detained. If they had short hair, they'd be detained. If they looked like they were clergy, they'd be detained. And there's a whole list in there. And then I start thinking, so pretty much what you're telling me is anybody would be detained. So it kind of took away from the overall theme that it was a racially charged action to be detained there in those southern states. But the message was still clear. But that whole paragraph, in my opinion, was counterproductive. Now, the reason I say this is still relevant is because I'm in Arizona. That's where I live. But I have traveled from Phoenix to Louisiana, taking that same route. And in fact, the route that she talks about from Tucson to El Paso, there is a border checkpoint right there by Las Cruces. And I've been through it several times. And over 5 trips and 3 military TDYs, I have been stopped at least 10 times going from Arizona to Louisiana and Texas And every time, either at a border point or just driving down the road, it usually ends with somebody coming up to my window. I roll it down, and they're like, "Are you a U.S. citizen?" And I'm like, "Yeah, sure am." And they walk away. One time I had a cop show up, and my blues uniform for the military was hanging in the back window. And before I could say anything, he was like, "Never mind, sir. Have a nice day." So I can relate to it because I'm like, man, those same border points that she's talking about from when this piece was written are still there, and that kind of stuff still happens in those southern states. But we're not having, at least in my 10 times and how many trips I've told you I've taken, I've never been pulled off on the side of the road, told to exit my vehicle. So there has been progression between, I believe this was written in 94 and now. Perhaps we still have the actions happening, but there's definitely, there's obviously less going over the border, no pun intended, by the Border Patrol. At the same time, though, it's kind of current when you look at all the racial debates that have been going on with the riots, such as the Boston riots and such, because it teeters on that line of whether or not cops are abusing their power, or if there's something teetering on the other side, just like in Silko's piece. When she's describing when her and her cousin got pulled onto the side of the road, she had what she called medical marijuana in her purse, which she had clearly stated that she was going across state lines. So even if medical marijuana was legal, which it probably wasn't, you're definitely not allowed to travel across state lines with it. So she can paint herself as innocent all she wants, but she made it sound like, oh, it was just medicinal. It's like, no, you still broke the law. So right, wrong, or indifferent up until that point, if she'd been caught with it and detained, did she really have a reason to feel wrongly accused at that point? So looking at both those pieces as nonfiction, I think it proves that the further away we move from an event, the nonfiction from that generation and that literary canon becomes harder to relate to and less important. And I think that's just natural actions in history. We still keep that because, it's good to teach the foundation to make sure it doesn't repeat. But it's very positive that when I read Douglas's work, it doesn't correlate to me. Some people are like, oh, well, your heritage should ring in and it should cut you deep. I have people at work, friends of mine that they're like, well, my ancestors were slaves and I still feel that emotion. I'm like, how do you feel anything from that? I've never experienced anything like that. I don't want to feel anything like that. And, there is a separation. There should be a separation. There's a difference between knowing history and trying to feel history. It's in the past for a reason and it needs to stay there. So, moving into fiction and poetry, however, I think this correlates well with the ideal I was saying about history, because when we're talking about these actions, fiction and poetry very much live off of the cliche of leading a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. As an author, you're always taught you're supposed to give an emotion out there, but you're not supposed to plainly say what the emotion is, because the reader is supposed to get that on their own. Otherwise, you're not being active, and you're not pushing it. Therefore, a piece of fiction that is doing its job properly is not going to lay it all out there. They're going to expect that the reader can gather the information it needs, and usually the reader does that through personal experience. Well, in the case of fiction and poetry from this time period, it is very hard for an audience to relate to that emotion and pull from it because, as I said, we don't deal with slavery on any medium. We don't have slave owners, we don't have slaves, so we can read it, we can empathize, but the emotion is not grasped the way that it was when it was written. And that is why the nonfiction work is more powerful for the message because it is point blank. Douglas doesn't hold any punches. He just lays it all out there. So the reader doesn't have to dig through the fiction and do what normal audiences do. So for this particular topic, as much as I hate to say it, nonfiction is definitely more powerful in delivering the message. So that's all part one. So moving on to part two, fiction, this whole ideal that we had that author, just because she was white, but writing from the vantage point of a slave, that whole, I think it's a dumb notion. And the only reason is we've had pen names for how long, and authors do this for a very specific reason, because they want to not show who they are. Because when you write a book, you're putting it all out there, and sometimes people look at who you are and they interpret the wrong thing. And that's a case in point on what the issue is here. I think instead it goes back to my week one point I've made, and I feel is probably the most important thing I've learned from my graduate studies, that no author can hide their take on society from their writing. So whether she was a slave owner, a slave empathizer, or a slave herself, she has, during her generation, she had encountered all of it. She has a vantage point from all of it. So no matter what she writes, that you can pull from her generational society points that are true, fiction or not. So for somebody to say that it's improper or that it can't carry the same level of emotion once you realize that it was a white woman instead of a black slave, I don't think that's true. That's the power of fiction, is if you are a good writer and you know what you're doing, then you can make an audience feel anything that you want them to feel. So I guess maybe as a graduate studies creative writing major, I just think that that's a false statement. I would never feel that way. I would like to think that it's all based off of ability and talent and your experiences at that point. So that's pretty much it. I kept it under 15 minutes this time. That's great. So that's what I had. I'm sorry it's a day late between feeling the 24-hour bug yesterday and traveling to this luxurious house today. It kind of took me a little longer to get this post out. So thanks for watching, and talk to you next week.